50 years of friendship, Billy and I have spent countless hours hanging out, having meals, talking on the phone, helping each other through sometimes some very tough times.
What does a farewell sound like when the man being honored is still here to hear it? This is not about death, but about legacy. About a ceremonial farewell where Billy Crystal steps forward at a tribute framed like a funeral and turns the room and the world silent. The night framed as a funeral. The staging was intentional. Dark drapery, measured pacing, a tone that suggested finality without declaring it. Rob Reiner was being honored, not buried. Yet the ceremony borrowed the language of a funeral because funerals demand honesty. They remove celebration and leave only truth. Before anyone spoke, the room understood the stakes. The choice to frame the evening this way was not theatrical excess. It was discipline. A funeral is not about spectacle. It is about accounting. It forces a room to stop clapping for outcomes and start measuring influence. By adopting that visual language, the tribute stripped away industry polish and placed Reiner's body of work under a quieter, sharper light. No swelling music, no highlight reel racing toward applause. Just space, silence. Expectation. Rob Reiner's reputation has long been associated with warmth, films that invite rather than intimidate, that listen rather than lecture. That irony hovered over the room. A creator known for emotional accessibility was being honored in an environment built on restraint. The tension felt deliberate. It echoed what collaborators have often said about his process. One longtime colleague once noted that Rob never chased control. He built trust first, and the tone followed. The staging reflected that same philosophy. Atmosphere before statement. Meaning before applause. There is also something quietly confrontational about staging a farewell for someone who is still present. Traditional funerals give praise without consequence. The subject cannot hear it, cannot be burdened by it. This night removed that safety. Everything spoken would be heard by the person it described. That knowledge sharpened the air in the room. It turned every sentence into a choice. Honesty mattered more than generosity. The darkness served another purpose. It collapsed time. Reiner's career spans decades and genres: romantic comedy, courtroom drama, coming-of-age fantasy. A conventional tribute would segment those eras neatly. This one refused to. The absence of visual distraction flattened chronology. It suggested that all of it existed at once, that patterns mattered more than milestones. When memory is treated this way, consistency becomes visible. The room was not being asked to recall titles. It was being asked to recognize values. Midway through the evening, the framing began to reveal its deeper intention. This was not about reverence. It was about responsibility. As one speaker would later imply, you don't dress a room like this unless you're asking people to tell the truth. That truth was not measured in awards or revenue. It was measured in trust. Actors trusted Reiner with vulnerability. Writers trusted him with voice. Audiences trusted him not to disguise sincerity with irony. Even the pacing of the night mirrored a memorial service. No rush, no pressure to fill space. Silence was allowed to linger, sometimes uncomfortably. Those pauses mattered. In them, the audience stopped being spectators and became participants. Each person was left alone with their own inventory: where they were when they first saw the work, who they were with, what it taught them about listening, about restraint, about decency. The funeral framing also resisted something deeply ingrained in the industry: the obsession with reinvention. Funerals acknowledge continuity. They suggest a through line rather than a series of pivots. Reiner's career is often described as eclectic, but the atmosphere of the night argued otherwise. Different genres, same compass. Humor without cruelty. Drama without cynicism. A belief that audiences could handle sincerity without being patronized. As one peer once summarized, Rob's films never tried to impress you. They tried to take care of you. By the time Billy Crystal approached the stage, the architecture of the evening had already done its work. Expectations had been recalibrated. Laughter, when it arrived, would need purpose. Praise would need weight. The room was no longer primed for celebration. It was primed for reckoning. The darkness had taught the audience how to listen. In choosing a funeral without death, the tribute made a quiet but radical statement. Legacy is not something assigned after silence. It is something confronted while the work and the person behind it can still feel the weight of it. That requires courage from the speakers and humility from the one being honored. But it is also the only way a tribute can tell the truth without nostalgia dulling its edges. The room understood that before the first word was spoken. That understanding changed everything that followed. Why Billy Crystal was the only choice. Billy Crystal did not walk on stage as entertainment. He arrived as history. His relationship with Rob Reiner stretched across decades of comedy, trust, and cultural touchstones. He carried credibility without gravity, warmth without indulgence. The audience expected laughter. What they received instead was something rarer, precision. That precision was earned over time, not rehearsed for the night. Billy Crystal's career has always existed at the intersection of humor and human observation, where jokes are less about punchlines and more about recognition. That sensibility made him uniquely qualified to speak in a room framed for honesty rather than applause. He understood instinctively that this was not a set. It was a responsibility. Crystal's connection to Rob Reiner was not transactional. It was built on shared rhythm. They came from a tradition of comedy that valued timing as a form of respect, knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Over the years, that understanding matured into something steadier. As Crystal once reflected in another context, the laugh is optional, the truth is not. That belief shaped how he approached the tribute. Humor would be present, but only when it clarified rather than distracted. The audience sensed this almost immediately. Crystal did not rush his opening. He allowed silence to settle, as if testing whether the room was ready to listen. In an industry that often rewards speed and volume, his restraint felt deliberate. This was not hesitation. It was calibration. He aligned himself with the tone the night demanded. Part of what made him the only viable choice was trust. Both directions. Rob Reiner trusted Crystal not to turn the moment into performance. The audience trusted Crystal not to fracture the gravity of the setting. That dual trust is rare and cumulative. It cannot be improvised. One collaborator once described Crystal's presence by saying, "He never enters a room to take it over. He enters to understand it." That instinct was visible in every pause he allowed to breathe. When humor did arrive, it arrived softly, not as release, but as alignment. Crystal used familiarity to steady the room, not distract it. A brief line here, a knowing glance there. Each moment of levity acknowledged shared history without leaning on it. The laughter that followed felt earned, almost restrained, as if the audience knew too much to indulge freely. What followed those moments was where Crystal's role became irreplaceable. He transitioned from humor into reflection without signaling the shift. There was no tonal whiplash, because there was no performance boundary to cross. Comedy and seriousness were not opposites in his delivery. They were adjacent. This is where many speakers falter. They announce gravity. Crystal embodied it. His credibility came not from authority, but from proximity. He had watched Reiner work. He had seen how decisions were made when no one was watching. That vantage point allowed him to speak about process rather than outcome. He spoke of listening, of patience, of how trust on a set alters the work that emerges from it. At one point, he paraphrased a sentiment long shared privately, noting that Rob made people feel safe enough to be honest, and that honesty stayed on the screen. The room leaned in because the words carried weight, without ornament. Crystal did not inflate Reiner's legacy. He clarified it. That distinction mattered. Inflation invites skepticism. Clarity invites recognition. The audience was not being told what to feel. They were being reminded of what they already understood. Even Crystal's physical presence reinforced this approach. He stood still. He did not pace or gesture broadly. His stillness mirrored the night's restraint. In doing so, he became an extension of the staging rather than a disruption of it. The camera did not need to chase energy. It simply held. By choosing Billy, Crystal, the organizers ensured the tribute would not fracture under its own symbolism. Any louder voice might have cracked the tone. Any lighter touch might have diminished it. Crystal understood the moment without being instructed. He did not elevate himself within it. He lowered himself to meet it. As the speech unfolded, it became clear the audience was not watching a comedian adapt to seriousness. They were watching an observer articulate something long understood, but rarely spoken aloud. Billy Crystal was not the only person who could have spoken that night, but he was the only one who could have spoken that way. Humor as an invitation, not a shield. Crystal opened gently, using humor the way a surgeon uses anesthetic. The room relaxed. Then he slowed the rhythm. The pauses lengthened. The jokes stopped landing because they stopped trying to. Comedy became a bridge, not the destination, guiding the audience towards something more vulnerable. This was not accidental. Billy Crystal has always understood that humor is most powerful when it lowers defenses rather than raises them. On this night, laughter was not an escape hatch. It was an entry point. The first moments of levity were familiar enough to feel safe, almost reflexive. The audience laughed because they recognized the cadence. Then, just as instinct took over, Crystal eased off. The silence that followed felt intentional, like a door left open rather than abruptly closed. In many tributes, humor functions as armor. It protects the speaker from emotion and the audience from discomfort. Crystal rejected that instinct. He treated comedy as a shared language, not a shield. Each joke acknowledged the room before releasing it. As one observer later paraphrased his approach, Billy never uses humor to hide the truth. He uses it to get closer to it. That philosophy governed the pacing of the entire segment. The pauses were as important as the punchlines. Crystal allowed space after laughter, resisting the urge to stack jokes back to back. In that space, something shifted. The audience began listening differently. They were no longer waiting to be entertained. They were waiting to be addressed. This recalibration changed the emotional contract of the night. Humor stopped being transactional and became relational. What made this transition work was Crystal's refusal to telegraph it. There was no moment where he announced a turn toward seriousness. He simply let the jokes thin out. A line that might have ended in a punchline instead ended in a breath. A familiar rhythm slowed just enough to feel intentional. The audience followed without resistance because they trusted him. This trust did not come from sentimentality. It came from discipline. Crystal never asked the audience to abandon laughter altogether. He just asked them to reconsider its purpose. Humor, in his hands, became a way of acknowledging shared history without leaning on it. It reminded the room that joy and gravity are not opposites. They are neighbors. At one point, Crystal reflected on the nature of comedy itself, paraphrasing a belief he has long carried. A joke only matters if it knows where it belongs. On this night, jokes belonged at the beginning, not the center. They opened the door, then stepped aside. What followed needed no disguise. The shift toward vulnerability was gradual, almost imperceptible. By the time the audience realized they were no longer being entertained, they were already engaged. This is the difference between humor as performance and humor as invitation. Performance demands attention. Invitation earns it. Crystal chose the latter, trusting the room to meet him there. The effect was visible. People leaned forward. Laughter became quieter, more selective. The atmosphere felt less like a theater and more like a conversation held in confidence. This was not comedy receding. It was comedy transforming. Crystal's restraint also prevented the tribute from tipping into sentimentality. Excessive humor would have cheapened the gravity. Excessive seriousness would have felt imposed. By balancing the two, he allowed emotion to surface naturally. When sincerity arrived, it did not feel staged. It felt earned. This approach reflected a deeper understanding of tone, one that aligned closely with Rob Reiner's own sensibilities. Both men have long believed that audiences are capable of emotional complexity. They do not need to be guided with signposts. They need to be trusted. As one longtime collaborator once summarized that shared belief, if you respect the audience's intelligence, they will give you their attention. The silence that followed Crystal's early humor was not empty. It was charged. It signaled that the room was ready for something more exposed. Comedy had done its work. It had softened the ground without distracting from what was about to be said. In choosing humor as an invitation rather than a shield, Crystal altered the trajectory of the entire tribute. He demonstrated that laughter does not have to deflect emotion. It can escort it into the room. That choice demanded confidence, restraint, and a willingness to be still. By the time the humor fully receded, the audience was no longer waiting for jokes. They were waiting for truth. And because Crystal had led them there gently, without force or flourish, they were prepared to receive it. The line that reframed everything. Midway through the speech, Crystal shifted completely. He spoke about Rob Reiner not as a filmmaker, but as a guardian of tone. Someone who protected honesty on set, who made collaboration feel safe. The room leaned in. This was no longer praise. It was testimony. Up to that moment, the tribute had moved with careful balance. Humor had softened the room. Silence had taught it how to listen. This was the pivot, the point where the night stopped circling its meaning and named it outright. Crystal's voice did not rise. It narrowed. The words slowed, as if precision suddenly mattered more than flow. The audience felt it immediately. Something essential had been articulated. Calling Rob Reiner a guardian of tone reframed an entire career in a single phrase. It redirected attention away from titles and achievements towards something less visible, but more durable. Tone is not credited. It does not appear in box office reports. Yet it governs everything that lasts. Crystal suggested that Reiner's greatest contribution was not what he made, but how he made honesty possible within the work. The room responded not with applause, but with stillness. That reaction mattered. Applause would have turned the line into a moment. Silence turned it into recognition. As one person later reflected backstage, you could feel everyone quietly agreeing at the same time. This was not revelation. It was confirmation. Crystal expanded the idea carefully. He spoke about sets where listening mattered more than hierarchy, where fear was replaced by clarity. Collaboration was framed not as efficiency, but as trust repeated over time. In doing so, he positioned Reiner's legacy as ethical rather than stylistic. The work endured because the process respected people. This reframing changed how the audience understood the films themselves. Scenes once remembered for humor or emotion now carried another layer. They were the product of safety. Safety to fail, to question, to bring something personal into the room. Crystal implied that without that environment, the work might have existed, but it would not have felt the same. There was risk in stating this so plainly. By focusing on tone rather than output, Crystal challenged the industry's usual metrics of success. Influence, he suggested, cannot always be measured, only felt. One longtime collaborator once summarized Reiner's approach by saying, "He made people better by making them comfortable being themselves." The line resonated because it described a lived experience rather than a theory. Crystal refused to dramatize the point. He trusted the idea to carry its own weight. That restraint kept the moment from tipping into sentimentality. The truth was offered without ornament, and that plainness gave it authority. The phrase "guardian of tone" also reframed leadership itself. Guardianship implies protection without dominance. Crystal positioned Reiner not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one ensuring the room functioned. For many listening, that distinction landed deeply. One industry veteran later paraphrased the sentiment simply, "Rob didn't command rooms, he calibrated them." As the idea settled, the audience began quietly reinterpreting their own experiences. Tone, once named, became unmistakable. It explained why some collaborations felt expansive and others constricting. Crystal had given the room language for something they had long felt but never defined. In the seconds that followed, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Shoulders lowered, breathing slowed. The room no longer felt ceremonial, it felt personal. This was no longer about honoring a career from a distance. It was about recognizing a standard many had benefited from without ever naming it. That recognition carried a quiet weight, one that did not ask to be shared out loud. Crystal then connected tone to legacy. Awards fade. Rankings shift. Tone leaves residue. It shapes how people carry themselves into the next project, the next room. At one point, he paraphrased a sentiment long shared privately. Rob cared more about how the work felt to make than how it looked to sell. The line drew a collective breath. He did not linger on the phrase that reframed everything. He did not repeat it. He trusted the room to carry it forward. That trust was rewarded. The tribute crossed a threshold, from celebration into understanding. And in that moment, Rob Reiner's legacy was no longer being praised. It was being defined. When the room fell silent, applause faded. People stopped shifting in their seats. What Crystal offered was not nostalgia, but clarity. Why the work lasted. Why the influence spread quietly rather than loudly. The tribute felt less like a performance and more like a collective acknowledgement of something everyone had felt but never articulated. Silence is rarely accidental in a room like this. It usually signals discomfort or distraction. This silence arrived for the opposite reason. The room had caught up. Crystal had guided the audience to a place where reaction felt unnecessary. Applause would have fractured the moment. So people stayed still. They listened. What Crystal articulated in that stretch was not a summary of Rob Reiner's career, but an explanation of its endurance. He spoke about residue rather than results, the way certain work lingers long after trends fade. Influence, he suggested, often travels quietly, shaping how people approach collaboration and trust. As one listener later paraphrased the feeling, "It sounded like someone finally said why it all stayed with us." The lack of reaction created something communal. In the absence of noise, individual memories aligned. People were not recalling scenes or lines. They were recalling how the work made them feel, unrushed, unmocked, respected. Crystal was not instructing the audience what to remember. He was giving them permission to notice what had already stayed with them. This kind of stillness cannot be commanded. It has to be earned. Crystal earned it by refusing to fill space. He let his words land without cushioning them in humor or emphasis. The pauses stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. The room adjusted its breathing to match his cadence. In that silence, hierarchy dissolved. Status, seating, stopped mattering. Everyone was listening from the same place. That leveling mirrored what Crystal had been describing about Reiner's sets, spaces where contribution outweighed position. The structure of the tribute began reflecting its message, not symbolically, but behaviorally. Crystal did not push for agreement. He framed his observations as recognition, not declaration. That allowed the audience to meet him without resistance. As one industry peer once put it, they never tell you what to feel, they trust you to feel it. The silence that followed confirmed that trust had been honored. Time seemed to stretch. A few seconds carried more weight than entire speeches earlier in the night. The audience was no longer processing information. They were reflecting. The tribute had quietly shifted from being about Rob Reiner to being about the values his work normalized: patience, generosity, emotional safety. Crystal spoke about influence as something lateral, not loud. It spreads through example, rather than assertion. That idea resonated deeply in a room full of people who had witnessed louder leadership fail. Reiner's influence, as framed here, showed up in how people treated each other when no one was watching. The silence became a form of respect, not reverence, but acknowledgement. Reverence elevates. Acknowledgement absorbs. The room was absorbing the idea that success does not always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like creating conditions where others can be honest without fear of punishment. What made the moment endure was its restraint. No one rushed to summarize it. No one tried to capture it immediately. The room allowed the meaning to settle on its own terms, trusting that what mattered would not disappear simply because it was quiet. Crystal allowed one longer pause. No one rushed to fill it. That choice revealed how completely the room had recalibrated. As one attendee later reflected, it didn't feel awkward, it felt necessary. The silence itself had become part of the tribute. In that moment, the absence of reaction prevented the tribute from becoming consumable. There was nothing to cheer, nothing to cut cleanly into a highlight. What mattered resisted packaging. It had to be carried internally. That resistance echoed the very qualities being honored: restraint, trust, and patience. One observer later summarized the atmosphere with quiet precision, saying, "The room wasn't watching anymore, it was remembering." That distinction mattered. Watching is passive. Remembering is participatory. By the time Crystal continued, the audience followed without resistance. The silence had done its work. It had turned a speech into shared understanding. And for a brief, rare stretch of time, an entire room agreed, without needing to say a word. A farewell spoken in the present tense. Crystal did not close with finality. He offered gratitude without distance, respect without retrospect. He spoke as if Rob Reiner's legacy was not complete, because it was not. The funeral framing had done its work, but the ending refused closure. This was not an ending. It was a mirror, held up while it still mattered. In most tributes, the final moments are designed to seal meaning. They summarize, resolve, and release the room. Crystal resisted that instinct. He understood that closure would have betrayed the values the night had been honoring. A closed legacy is safe and fixed. Reiner's was neither. By speaking in the present tense, Crystal kept the legacy alive. Unfinished, accountable, still in motion. The language mattered. Crystal avoided phrases that implied conclusion. There was no looking back or final word. Instead, he spoke about influence as something ongoing, something still rippling through people making choices shaped by what they had learned from Reiner. As Crystal paraphrased the sentiment, this isn't about what Rob did. It's about what people are still doing because of him. That distinction reframed the ending. The audience felt the shift. Rather than leaning back in relief, they leaned forward again. The refusal to conclude demanded presence. It reminded everyone that legacy is not owned by the past. It is negotiated daily through behavior, not memory. Crystal was not offering comfort. He was offering responsibility. This approach aligned perfectly with the funeral framing that opened the night. Funerals traditionally look backward. This one turned that expectation inside out. The ceremony used the language of finality to demand honesty, then removed the comfort of distance at the end. The result was unsettling in the best way. The room was not allowed to admire Reiner safely from afar. They were asked to measure themselves against what he represented. Crystal's tone remained steady. There was no emotional swell designed to cue applause. His restraint underscored the point. This was not about landing a moment. It was about leaving the room changed. As one observer later summarized, he didn't close the book. He handed it back to everyone else. That handoff was deliberate. The present tense honored Reiner without freezing him into an icon. It acknowledged that his influence was ongoing, that his standards still mattered, that his presence still shaped rooms even when he was not in them. This form of respect carried weight because it resisted nostalgia. The audience responded with a different kind of attention. There was no rush toward applause, no collective exhale. Instead, there was a shared stillness that felt anticipatory. People understood the night was not releasing them from responsibility. It was assigning it. Crystal reinforced this by avoiding any definitive moral. He did not instruct the room on how to carry the legacy forward. He trusted them to know. That trust mirrored the leadership style he had been describing all evening. As one longtime collaborator once put it, Rob trusted people to rise to the moment instead of telling them how. In doing so, Crystal prevented the tribute from becoming sentimental. Sentimentality closes the door. This ending left it open. It allowed each person to decide what the legacy meant in practice, in how they listened, how they collaborated, how they protected tone in their own spaces. The mirror Crystal held up was not flattering by default. It was honest. The refusal of closure also resisted canonization. Canonized figures are admired, not emulated. By keeping Reiner's legacy active, Crystal made it usable. He suggested that the highest form of tribute was not applause, but adoption, carrying the values forward into new rooms and new conversations. As Crystal reached his final words, posture shifted across the room. People sat straighter, not out of formality, but recognition. The tribute had quietly asked something of them. One final line landed without emphasis. Crystal paraphrased a belief he had returned to all night. Legacy only matters if it's still asking something of us. The line did not seek applause. It settled. When Crystal stepped back, there was no sense of completion. And that was the point. The ending refused to let the night become memory. It insisted on relevance. That is why the farewell resonated. It was not a goodbye spoken over a finished story. It was a recognition offered mid-sentence, a legacy acknowledged while it was still alive enough to matter. What made this night endure was not the staging, the silence, or even the words themselves. It was the refusal to let legacy become comfortable. Rob Reiner was not honored as a finished story, but as an ongoing standard, one measured in trust, tone, and the courage to listen. Billy Crystal did not deliver a goodbye. He delivered a reminder that influence lives in behavior, not applause. Long after the lights dimmed, what remained was a quiet challenge. to carry forward the same restraint, generosity, and honesty that shaped the work being honored. That is how legacies stay alive, not through memory alone, but through practice. If this tribute resonated with you, share what moments stayed with you most in the comments. And if you value stories that look beyond fame and into meaning, subscribe for more cinematic reflections like this.